The Book of Denis is the third novel in the Myst trilogy, and this one is my favorite. It's a wild ride. I love how the story unfolds. This book has a lot going for it. I like how it ties everything from the first two books together. It's just a really cool story. I love the direction that they went in. It, pays off a lot of the stuff that was introduced in the second novel that I was a little iffy on. Here, it's just really awesome. I love this story. The story picks up with Artras and Catherine from the first novel, not Artras from the second novel because he's dead. So these two, Artras and Catherine, they are, leaving an age or preparing to leave one after they've befriended a lot of the people there. This is also when we meet a new character named Miriam. She kind of becomes not necessarily a main character, but an important character, and one that they were going to build off of in future novels, which I'll talk about at the end of this. But for right now, we follow kind of a slow process of Artras, Catherine, and a bunch of these other people as they kind of explore the ruins of Denis. So they've gone back to the main city, they're kind of going through the different ruins, fixing things up, and they're sort of exploring some of the ages that they can explore. Some of the books have been damaged, some of them, are pretty much empty because of the plague, but they're going through this very, very arduous process of finding everything, gathering up all the books that can be used, and they're looking for stuff specifically. They're trying to find the Guild of Maintainers marks to see if those ages had been, properly maintained. That's something that gets explained here, the whole maintenance of the ages and everything. So you had in the first book where Gen had no idea what he was doing and just copying the work of others, and all of his ages were unstable. You have the second book where they have all of these ages already because it's in the past, and people are just kind of going in and out of them willy-nilly. And here you have them trying to find all the stable ages, the ones that are going to be lasting a while and might possibly have survivors in them. Eventually, they do find ages that have people still alive, so they bring those survivors back, and it turns out they've got about 2,000 Denis that are still alive. So they all get together clearing the ruins, trying to rebuild the city as best they can, and throughout the book we kind of get this mention of the Great King. It's this legend of Denis folklore from thousands of years ago where there was this, great king, and he allegedly had this really awesome library, and then he just kind of disappears from the historical record, and nobody really knows if he exists. It's all foreshadowing the fact that he might have. He might have existed. But while they're clearing out some of the rubble, they find a shrine to apparently the Great King. They don't really know if it is the Great King or not, and he kind of... I'll talk about that later, but they eventually find a door that leads to another shrine, and they find another book there, so they find an age. And of course it's so old that there's no Guild of Maintainers mark on it. They don't know how long this age has been, just going on its own. And so they decide to explore it. They're very cautious about it. And they find that it is basically it is in a room inside of this huge ruined city on top of a giant plateau. No idea how old it is, no idea what's going on, they don't know who's actually there. They just learn that they're on a plateau. This age is significantly larger than anyone that they've ever been to, and it's inhabited by people because there are just vast cities there. It's a very, very prosperous age, and they're a little worried about actually, encountering these people because this age had been sealed away and, generally forgotten about. And so they kind of very cautiously go out there and they end up meeting at least one of the races that inhabits this world. And they find out that it's incredibly prosperous. Everyone there is very wealthy, or at least appears to be wealthy. There is like a servant class that is there, and it's kind of an interesting way of doing things. The more they explore this world, the more they discover that it's not exactly what it seems. So we learn that this place is called Tyranny, and eventually Artris and his group of buddies that are with him, they meet the king, and they kind of win him over. The king says, "Yeah, you can stay here. We'll set aside some land for you and the Denis, and everything will be wonderful." And on their way back, Artris kind of tells one of the people that they first met that he's not a full-blooded Denis. He's actually, mixed race. He's, human and Denis. And that's apparently a horrible thing. So they decide, he needs to die and everybody with him needs to die. And so they, send out a hit squad after him. But so there's another prophecy, which is a reoccurring thing here, that Tyranny would fall apart after like this breath of death came in, or something along those lines. I didn't write it down, but that's essentially what it was. And they thought that had happened to Denis and not to Tyranny, so they thought they had gotten around this prophecy. Turns out that Artris and all of his friends brought a bacteria with them, and that bacteria is just killing everybody on Tyranny because they have no defense against it. It's kind of a cool idea, and it calls back to a whole bunch of other different things, because this has happened all the time in different populations around the planet. You get exposed to something that you don't know what it is, and it just wreaks havoc on a population until eventually they build up an immunity to it, or get used to it, or somebody comes along with medication for it. So Tyranny, the ruling population, just gets decimated, and then the servant class gets decimated. And you find out that there was actually a slave class there. Everything that is being run is being operated by slaves, and there are billions of them on Tyranny. Their population is also reduced, but there's so goddamn many of them that it doesn't really matter. And this plague basically ends the empire. The king dies, and the ruling class is so decimated that they lose all control. The slaves rise up, and they kind of take over. So that's happy. And then they start to kind of work on rebuilding the whole society that they have, but it's going to be the slaves that are in charge, and they're going to try to be peaceful, but they don't really know what they're doing because they've never been in that situation. This is when things get really, really wild. So the slave masters, or the people that were keeping all the slaves in line, they come back with an army of 700,000 people or something like that, and they start just mowing through everything, killing everybody. They kill the ruling class, they kill the slaves, they're just taking over. And this causes one of our new main characters to come out, and they decide to, form their slave army and defeat the slave masters. They do, and then, the leader of the slave army decides, well, I'm going to be in charge, and he orders Artris and all of his friends' deaths. And so they start coming back. And then we have a little boy character who was introduced and not really fleshed out that well, but he's only really important in this one case where he ends up killing the leader of the slave army, and that causes that army to just sort of fall apart. And then Artris decides, well, fuck this. We're gonna leave. So basically, he leaves along with a lot of the slaves that just don't want to be there anymore, and they decide they're going to make a new age for the Denis, the slaves that are on tyranny, and then I think like one or two other populations that we've met along the way. And that's kind of how this ends. They seal tyranny back off, and they're done with that one, and that's the end of this book. It's a kind of a crappy ending to a just wild book, especially the last like 100 pages where stuff just goes crazy. So now that I've had kind of a chance to sit and think about this book for a while, I had a few things that I wish had been explored. The Great King and the split between Denis and tyranny is something that I find really interesting, and it's not really talked about because there's so much other stuff going on that one little thing gets fallen by the wayside. It would have been nice to learn more about why that age was sealed off and forgotten, but we don't really get that here. This might have been explained in the fourth and fifth books of the series, which had been planned, but they were scrapped, so we're probably never going to know how this story was actually going to end. The fourth book, from the rumors that I've read online, they said that the fourth book was written but never published, and they scrapped it. You can find like a sample chapter because that was released, and then you can see like concept art for the fourth book's cover, but it wasn't like approved or finalized, so it's there, but don't like read into it too much. It kind of seems like this whole project was pretty much abandoned like 20 years ago at this point. So the fourth book might exist in a completed form in somebody's desk somewhere, but it's never coming out. The fifth book, it sounds like they never even started writing that or really had like an idea of what they wanted it to be. Maybe they did, maybe they didn't, but that one's just never going to happen and gone. This actually leads to a lot of my frustration with this, and not with the book series itself, but with like the documenting of it. There's a lot of just bullshit about these books online, specifically about the fourth book. Yeah, I'll you know what, I'm going to break that off into its own section. I'll talk about that in just a second. But yeah, it's a whole complicated story. Myst has a lot of unwritten history in it that can be created by fans now, since Cyan has pretty much moved on from the series. They're off doing their own thing. And yeah, we've got these books that kind of lay out a foundation. So it's a cool little trilogy, but knowing that there were more books planned, it's a little disappointing with how it ends. Especially with just knowing what we know about what the fourth book was going to be, and with the sample chapter. It would have focused on Miriam, but yeah, that's just gone. Maybe they would have explored the Great King a little bit more, because that's something I really want to know more about. Maybe they find other books that are sealed away, and there just are other things to explore with the history of the Denis Empire. But yeah, those are just questions that we're we are never going to get answers to unless Cyan magically decides to revive this series, and it doesn't look like they have any interest in doing that, or even expanding it into other forms of media, since that stuff is pretty much gone too. Anyway, let's talk a little bit more about what I found when I looked into the fourth book. From what I've read, there were 2 more books in the series planned. The fourth was going to be the Book of Miriam. That was never released. According to those rumors, it was finished, but not released for whatever reason. You can find the concept art, as I mentioned. There are a few Reddit threads on this, but just from what the artist said, he made it as concept art, never approved. You can find a sample of the fourth book that's included with the Myst 5 manual, so that's available online. I haven't found anything on the fifth book, so that probably never even got past the planning phase of just, this is going to happen, but, whatever. I'm left with a whole lot of questions, a whole lot more questions than answers at this point. All of the media projects associated with the Myst seem to be dead and gone. Finding reliable information on what happened with these books can be just extremely difficult. It doesn't help that whenever you look for Book of Miriam, you find just a whole bunch of garbage, like fandom's god-awful wiki about it, which is worded in a way that makes it sound like the fourth book actually exists or is going to be a thing at some point. Whoever wrote that is just an asshole. Also, whoever put the sample chapter for the fourth book up on Goodreads, you're kind of a dick. I don't get why it's there. It shouldn't be there. It's not a book. It's just one sample chapter in a manual. It really gets frustrating when you go over stuff like this, because it's just like, I'm trying to find like an actual answer as to what's going on, and I just keep stumbling across horse shit. And yeah, I don't like it. This is one of the more frustrating parts of writing stuff like this. You want to present something to acknowledge like the planned books, and then you fall down a rabbit hole of just garbage. And yeah, it highlights everything that I don't like about the internet, where a lie gets turned into the truth, or it spreads faster than what the truth actually can be spread. And it's just, I hate it. On the one hand, it gives people a huge opportunity to share things that they're passionate about, but on the other hand, it's just sort of like, here's some bullshit that I heard and I'm going to pass it off as the truth. And it's just really frustrating. And it makes finding the truth online incredibly hard. And even when you do find it, you start guessing as to whether or not it's real. Anyway, let's just move on and wrap this whole thing up. This was my favorite of the three books. I would have liked to see where the other two books would have taken the series, but that wasn't meant to be. Things ended here, and it was up to the games to tell the story, and they did a pretty good job of it. Myst, the Book of Denis, is probably the best story out of the three of them. Parts of it get continued into the games, but what happened in Tyranny is mostly left out from what I can tell. There's some talk of slavery in a few of the other Denis going mad with power. Those get repeated in a few of the games, which is kind of interesting to see. The story went in a few directions I really wasn't expecting, and it had a few natural endings to it, but it just kept going. Near the end, I was getting worried because it seemed like there was so much more plot being introduced, and there just weren't enough pages to really get through all of it. If there was something that I didn't like about the book, it had to be just how some of the plot points get wrapped up a bit too quickly, or they have to be abandoned because there weren't any more books in the series. So you have stuff that probably was going to get continued in the Book of Miriam and maybe wrapped up, and that's just not ever going to happen. So, yeah, there's a lot going on here. I really dug this book. It has a crazy ending, and that ending lasts a long time. So, it's a really good book. I wish there was more, but there unfortunately just isn't any more to this. It ends with this, this one, and then if you want to know more or have an idea of what happened, you have to go and play the games. That's going to wrap things up. Let me know what you think in the comments below, and I will talk to you all later. Bye.